We know now that Sumerian literature consists primarily of epics, proverbs, fables, and essays of various sorts, especially essays in relation to education. That tells us something about the old education.
Before I die, please listen, we have gotten this wrong. Those are the final recorded words of Samuel Noah Kramer, the man who single-handedly translated more ancient Sumerian tablets than anyone in history. For 50 years, every textbook, every museum, every university lecture about where civilization began was built on his translations.
These disputations and these essays tell you a great deal. However, we must exonerate Mr. Seville a little bit. They are very difficult to translate.
His word was final. His work was gospel. Then, at 91 years old, weeks from death, sitting in a Philadelphia basement surrounded by tablets older than the Bible, he looked into a camera and said the one thing the academic world never wanted to hear, that his translations, the foundation of everything we think we know about humanity's first civilization, were catastrophically wrong. Not a detail, not a nuance, the entire framework. His colleagues tried to bury what he said next. They almost succeeded. This is what they didn't want you to hear. The tablet that broke him. The tablet came from Nippur, one of the oldest cities ever built, dated to around 2100 BCE. It had been sitting in the University of Pennsylvania Museum for decades, already translated, already published, already forgotten. Kramer handled it back in 1949. The text appeared to be a dialogue between a human and a god, discussing the origin of civilization. In his version, the god explains how the gods granted civilization to humanity as a gift. Clean, simple. It matched the established narrative perfectly. The Sumerians believed civilization came from the gods, just like the Egyptians, the Greeks, every ancient culture. Case closed. Move on, but here's the deal. That tablet never stopped nagging at him. 40 years of something feeling wrong that he couldn't name. A splinter lodged somewhere beneath 6 decades of certainty that he couldn't reach. Other scholars moved on to new discoveries, new publications, new accolades. Kramer kept circling back to Nippur, kept pulling the same tablet off the same shelf, kept reading the same lines he'd already published, and feeling each time that the words on the page didn't quite match the marks in the clay. So in 1988, at 91 years old, Kramer went back down to that basement one final time. His assistant described what happened. He sat under fluorescent lights, turning the clay over and over in his spotted hands, dust settling into his wrinkles. He wasn't reading it. He was trying to unread it, trying to forget his own translation, trying to see what the original Sumerian actually said instead of what he'd spent 4 decades assuming it must say. He held the tablet the way you'd hold a letter from someone you'd misunderstood for your entire life, carefully, painfully, like the truth might cut him if he gripped too hard. And then he stopped breathing. The color drained from his face. His hands froze. For 3 full minutes, he didn't move. His assistant stepped forward, asked if he needed a doctor. Kramer looked up. His voice was barely a whisper. I've had it wrong, all of it, for 40 years. The word he'd translated as gift, it could also mean awakening or remembering. The word he'd translated as human, it could mean sleeping one or unaware one. The word he'd translated as God, it could mean fully conscious one or aware power. Now, pay attention, because this changes everything. Reread with those alternative meanings, the tablet wasn't saying the gods gave civilization to primitive humans. It was saying civilization emerged when humans awakened to capacities they already possessed. That what we call gods might have been the Sumerians' way of describing states of consciousness. Modes of awareness we no longer access or even understand exist. Not beings in the sky handing down knowledge. Something inside the human mind switching on. This wasn't a footnote correction. This wasn't a scholarly quibble over a single word. This turned the entire text, and potentially every Sumerian text like it, completely inside out. And this wasn't coming from some fringe theorist on the internet. This was the one man on Earth whose translations defined the field, the man every other scholar in the world deferred to. And he was saying, with his final breath, that the foundation was rotten. If you want to understand why his own colleagues tried to silence him, and what he found when he went back through every major translation he'd ever published. Subscribe now, because this gets much darker. The doubts he couldn't silence. To understand why this discovery terrified the academic world, you need to understand what was at stake. Samuel Noah Kramer didn't just study the Sumerians. He was the Sumerians, as far as the modern world was concerned. He built the house that everyone else lived in, and now he was saying the house had no foundation. When he started in the 1920s, Sumerian was a dead language. No instruction manual, no native speakers, no dictionaries, nothing. Just thousands of clay fragments covered in wedge-shaped marks that nobody alive could decipher. He taught himself, comparing texts, hunting for patterns, building vocabulary word by word across 6 decades. Think about that. 6 decades of sitting alone in a basement, staring at marks pressed into clay by hands that turned to dust 3,000 years before Christ was born, and slowly, painstakingly, teaching himself to hear what those hands were trying to say. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced millions to a civilization most had never heard of. The first recorded love song, the first legal code, the first school system, the first written proverbs. All Kramer. Every time archaeologists dug up new tablets anywhere on Earth, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Iran, they shipped them to Philadelphia, to him. He was the funnel through which all of ancient Sumer passed before it reached the modern world. One man, one interpretation, one lens. And get this, he'd been quietly doubting his own work for decades before that basement. At moment, nobody wanted to see it, but the signs were there if you knew where to look. Go back to his academic papers from the 1960s and 70s. Really read them, not the conclusions, the footnotes. You'll find something unsettling. Little asides, almost whispered. This particular word has no exact English equivalent. This concept is difficult to render in modern terms. Certain passages have meaning that remains obscure. Normal scholarly caution, right? Every translator hedges, but those footnotes didn't stay quiet. They got louder, more frequent, more troubled. You can almost see him down there, circling words in red ink, crossing out translations and rewriting them, then crossing out the rewrites, stacking notebooks on top of notebooks, margins filling with question marks. The confident handwriting of the 1950s getting shakier, smaller, more hesitant with every passing decade. Not because his hands were aging, because his certainty was dying. By the 1980s, he wrote something that should have set off alarms across the entire field. The more I study these texts, the less certain I become about their true meaning. His colleagues rolled their eyes. "Sam's losing it," they whispered in faculty meetings. "Too long in that basement. An aging scholar going philosophical. Happens to the best of them." But Kramer wasn't going philosophical. He was going literal. He'd stumbled into a problem that cracked the foundation of everything. The Sumerian language had no word that clearly meant religion as we understand it. None. No distinction between natural and supernatural. No concept of miracle, because it had no baseline concept of normal for a miracle to violate. The Sumerians didn't separate sacred from secular, spiritual from material. These categories that structure our entire worldview simply didn't exist for them. Not because they were too primitive to invent them, but because their experience of reality apparently didn't require them. And that word, we, casually translate as God, it meant something closer to great power or cosmic principle. It wasn't even clear the Sumerians thought of these entities as beings in any sense we'd recognize. We read their texts and see religion, but Kramer was starting to suspect they weren't writing about religion at all. They were writing about something we don't have a word for. Something we might not even have a concept for anymore. In a 1987 interview, Kramer leaned forward. The interviewer later said his eyes looked haunted. "When I translate a Sumerian text about the creation of the world, I use English words like creation and world, but I am no longer convinced the Sumerians had anything like our concept of creation, or our concept of world. I think they might have been describing something completely different." His voice dropped. "And I have spent 50 years putting their thoughts into categories they would not have recognized." 1 year later, the tablet broke him. The fallout. After that basement moment, Kramer did something that took more courage than anything he'd done in 6 decades of scholarship. He showed his new translation to the people who had the most to lose. Dr. William Hallow at Yale, 40 years of career built on Kramer's original translations. Hallow had written books that cited Kramer's work on nearly every page. He'd supervised doctoral students whose entire dissertations rested on Kramer's framework. He read the reinterpretation. His face went white. His hand stopped mid-gesture over the paper. "Sam, this would invalidate everything. My books, my students' dissertations, all of it." Dr. Miguel Civil at Chicago didn't even finish reading. He set the paper down on his desk, took off his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. "You need to rest, Sam. This isn't scholarship anymore. This is a breakdown." But Kramer couldn't stop. Once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. He went back through his major translations, all the work that made his reputation. The creation myths, the flood narratives, the dialogues between kings and their advisors, text after text after text. And in every single one, he found the same fracture. He'd imposed modern categories onto Sumerian thought. He'd decided what the text must mean based on what made sense to a 20th century academic mind. Words he'd confidently translated as worship might have meant something closer to alignment. Phrases he'd rendered as divine commandment could have described inner knowing. Passages he'd read as prayers to distant gods might have been instructions for accessing states of mind. The entire field had followed him into these assumptions without question. Thousands of scholars, decades of dissertations, entire careers built on a framework that was now cracking from the inside out. And get this, Kramer wasn't saying his translations were sloppy. He was saying something far worse, that the English language itself might not have the right containers for Sumerian thought, that every act of translation had been, in some fundamental way, an act of distortion. Not because the translator was careless, but because modern consciousness and Sumerian consciousness might be so different that moving meaning from one to the other was like pouring water into a net. You go through the motions. You get nothing. What the Sumerians actually knew. Here's the catch. Once Kramer looked with fresh eyes, the evidence was everywhere, and it wasn't subtle. They're mathematics. The Sumerians used base 60. We use base 10 because we have 10 fingers. Obvious, right? But 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. Mathematically elegant in ways base 10 can't touch. We still use their system every single day. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. 4,000 years later, their math is embedded in how we measure time and space. Standard explanation. Clever mathematicians noticed. Useful properties. Kramer's question, what if base 60 wasn't a choice? What if it reflected how they actually perceived numerical relationships? A fundamentally different way of experiencing quantity that was more natural to them than counting on their fingers. Their astronomy was even stranger. They tracked planetary movements with precision that still startles modern scientists. Star charts accurate for millennia. Knowledge about planetary cycles. Europeans didn't rediscover until the Renaissance, thousands of years later. And they did this without telescopes, without computers, without any of the instruments we consider essential. The standard explanation says, patient observers with a lot of clear sky and a lot of time. Kramer asked a different question. What if they weren't just patiently observing? What if they were perceiving these patterns in a way we no longer can? What if the instruments weren't missing? What if the instrument was the mind itself? Then there was their technology. Irrigation systems of stunning sophistication that turned barren marshland into the most productive farmland on Earth. Massive ziggurats built with architectural precision that modern engineers still study. Advanced metallurgy. Urban planning for cities housing tens of thousands of people. Agriculture that fed entire civilizations. All of it appearing seemingly from nowhere around 4,500 BCE. No slow buildup. No gradual progression from simple to complex. Just, suddenly, civilization. And the tablets describing God's granting knowledge to humanity? What if those weren't religious myths at all? What if they were describing sudden cognitive shifts that made certain technologies immediately obvious? Not gifts from the sky, awakenings from within. But here's where it gets dark. Kramer compared early Sumerian tablets to later ones, from the centuries before the civilization collapsed around 2000 BCE. The later texts weren't just different in content, they were different in kind, more concrete, more practical, simpler. The early tablets had a quality of thought that was layered, dense, almost musical, ideas folding into each other in ways that resisted simple translation. The later tablets read like instruction manuals, flat, functional. The sophistication wasn't evolving, it was draining away, like watching a language lose its own vocabulary in real time. The later Sumerians were writing like people who no longer understood their own ancestors' texts. They were copying symbols whose deeper meaning had already been forgotten. The famous king list showed the same pattern. Early kings with impossibly long reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years. Later, kings with normal lifespans. Every scholar on Earth reads that as mythology transitioning to history. The Sumerians starting with fantasy and gradually getting more realistic. A primitive civilization growing up. Learning to count properly. Kramer read it differently. He read it as a record of something being lost. Whatever those early numbers represented, and it clearly wasn't literal years as we understand them, the shift to normal lifespans marked a point where something fundamental changed about how the Sumerians experienced and recorded reality. The numbers didn't get more accurate. The consciousness behind them got smaller, more limited, more like ours. And once that shift happened, it never reversed. The early way of seeing was gone, and the Sumerians who came after couldn't get it back, even though the tablets describing it were sitting right in front of them. In his final interview, weeks before death, his voice was barely audible. I think Sumer's collapse wasn't a political event. It was a consciousness event. Something about how they experienced reality changed, and once it changed, they couldn't maintain their civilization. He leaned closer to the camera, eyes wet. We are their descendants, living in the aftermath of that change, trying to read their texts but unable to understand them, because we're on the other side of the divide. What they buried with him. Samuel Noah Kramer died on November 26, 1990, 93 years old. His obituary celebrated his translations, his decades of achievement. It mentioned his honorary degrees. It praised his dedication to a field he'd essentially created. It did not mention his late-life doubts. It did not discuss his final interviews. It did not acknowledge that the man who defined our understanding of Sumer had spent his dying days insisting that understanding was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The academic establishment moved on, quietly, efficiently, the way institutions always do when someone threatens the structure from the inside. His earlier translations stayed in the textbooks. His original interpretations kept shaping how Sumer was taught in every university on the planet. The narrative he built, and then desperately tried to tear down in his final years, remained fully intact, as if those last interviews never happened, as if a dying man's confession was just an old scholar losing his grip. But here's the catch. Kramer's doubts didn't die with him. They couldn't. Because once you see the fracture, you can't unsee it. And a small number of researchers noticed. Scholars in consciousness studies and cognitive anthropology have started picking up where Kramer left off, questioning whether ancient civilizations thought in fundamentally different ways than we do. Some have begun retranslating Sumerian texts with his late insights in mind. The results are startling. Texts that looked like religious myths start reading as descriptions of consciousness states. King lists become records of different modes of existence. Creation stories become accounts of cognitive awakening rather than divine intervention. Hymns that seem like worship start sounding like techniques. Instructions for shifting perception, for accessing something. The Sumerians considered natural, but that we've long since forgotten how to reach. None of this has reached mainstream academia. Too many careers at stake. Too many reputations built on the old framework. Too many textbooks that would need to be rewritten. Too many dissertations that would collapse. Too many tenured professors who would have to admit they spent their lives teaching something that might not be true. But the deeper resistance is this. If Kramer was right, our entire story about human progress falls apart. We think we're the pinnacle, the most advanced humans who ever lived, the ones who finally figured it out. But what if the Sumerians weren't primitive? What if they had capacities we can't even name anymore? What if what we call progress means gaining certain abilities while losing others? we don't even know are missing. The tablets are still there, thousands of them, in museums, in archives, in university basements, not so different. From the one where Kramer spent his life, covered in cuneiform, we can technically read. But if Kramer was right, we're reading words while missing meanings, translating language while failing to translate the consciousness that created it, staring at the surface of something whose depth we can no longer perceive. His last words on camera, the ones they tried to bury. Before I die, please listen, we have gotten this wrong. Not the details, the whole framework. And until we admit that our modern consciousness might not be capable of understanding ancient consciousness, we will keep teaching a history that never happened, and missing a truth we desperately need to recover. So, here's my question. Do you think we've lost something our ancestors had? Or was Kramer simply wrong? Drop your theory in the comments, and if you want more forbidden history the academic establishment doesn't want you to see, smash that like button and subscribe. See you in the next one.